Let's take our hymn books one more time. 478. Soldiers of Christ arise. And the question comes up, can we sing Soldiers of Christ arrive while we're sitting down? I don't think so. Let's stand together, please. Sing right out for me. Soldiers of Christ arise and put your honor on, strong in the strength which God supplies, His eternal Son, strong in the Lord of hosts, and in His mighty arm, the strength of Jesus Christ is more than conqueror. Stand then in His great might, with all His strength endue, and take to arm you for the fight, the panoply of God. From strength to strength go on, wrestle and fight and pray, tread all the powers of darkness down, and win the wealth of day. Leave no unguarded place, no weakness of the soul. Take every virtue, every grace, and fortify the whole, that having all things done, and all your conflicts past, ye may come to Christ alone, and stand entire at last. Good singing. You may be seated.
I want to thank Anna for playing with us for us tonight. Did a great job, and appreciate that. I was going to try to sing this morning, but we kind of ran out of time. Plus, Julie couldn't have sung it with me anyway, and I know you'd rather hear her than me anyway, so. At least we didn't hear any amens that time. Anyway, this is a Mac Lynch song that I felt went well with the theme for the day. It's called God's Refining Fire. O Lord, we pray, Thy will be done. Our Master, here am I. We pray you do a mighty work, that to the flesh we die. And when the answer comes to us in form of trial and test, we fail to see your loving hand. Refining fire is best. God's refining fire, God's refining fire. May it purge me now and make of me what you'd require. Oh Lord, feed the fire, your refining fire. Now as gold and silver must be tried, Lord, may my heart be purified. Lord, send your great refining fire, that I may stand when you appear, abide till you return. Oh, place quickly that all the dross be burned. Whether furnace of affliction, Lord, or unfulfilled desire, bring forth a vessel pure and tried by your refining fire. God's refining fire, God's refining fire. May it purge me now and make of me what you require. Oh Lord, feed the fire, your refining fire. Now as gold and silver must be tried, Lord, may my heart be purified. Lord, send your great refining fire. What's that? Oh. Revelation chapter 2. Revelation chapter 2. And we'll read all 4 verses this evening that cover the church at Smyrna. Beginning in verse number 8. And unto the angel of the church in Smyrna write, These things saith the first and the last, which was dead and is alive. I know thy works, and tribulation, and poverty, but thou art rich. And I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews, and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. Fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, that ye may be tried. And ye shall have tribulation 10 days. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. He that overcometh shall not be hurt of the second death. Of course, I already preached this morning on verses 9 and 10, and I don't intend to repeat much of that. I will probably remind you of a few things there, but I just want to give you a little bit of an overview of what the Lord says to this church at Smyrna. Again, I remind you, we've talked about this each week. We talked about it back when we started the series, and we talked about the 7 churches then, and I listed them for you. But God, in His sovereignty and in His wisdom, told John to write to 7 churches. They were not the only 7 churches in Asia Minor. They weren't the only 7 churches anywhere. You know, there was a whole lot more, there were many more churches than that were started in John's time. There was churches in Greece and a church at Rome we know about because of the book of Romans. There were churches throughout Asia. And I don't know, I've not sat down and tried to count how many we are told about in the New Testament, but certainly it was many more than just 7. But I believe that the Holy Spirit spoke through John to these 7 churches to help us have what we need in any situation we might face as a church, that we might honor God, and that we might be rebuked if we fall under one of those churches that had one of those things that was wrong with them. That we might understand that those are, in God's sight, things that need to be worked on and corrected. Certainly no church is perfect, because every church is made up of quite imperfect individuals. And certainly every church is led by a quite imperfect pastor. And the leadership of any church is also just as imperfect. But we should all be striving to live in a way that would please our God. And as a church, we should be striving to please our God not only individually, but as a church. And I believe these 7 churches teach us not only what God is looking for in a church, but help us understand what we as a church ought to be like and what we as a church ought to avoid. So we talked last week about the church at Ephesus. And this week we're talking about the church at Smyrna, the second one. The church at Ephesus is the church that had lost its first love. The church at Smyrna is known as the suffering church. And you have your charts there and your pages. If you need more, did anybody need another one tonight? I didn't ask earlier. Marcy, I don't know if you have them, but they're on the front seat there. Okay, good. All right, I think everybody else should have your sheets from that we handed out last week. Smyrna is the suffering church. So, first of all, let's look at the city itself. The place is the city of Smyrna. Smyrna is about 40 miles mostly north of Ephesus. It's not far. It was the only other city that was also a port city, I believe. I believe it's the only other city that was also a port city. It was very prominent. It was second as a port city only to Ephesus. Ephesus was larger, but Ephesus, if you remember, I mentioned last week, had the problem of the silting of the river that emptied out into the Aegean Sea, such that now the site of Ephesus is something like 10 miles from the place where it used to be because of the silting that has happened in that area, and it is no longer a port. Smyrna is a port, a beautiful port. It did not have that problem, and so it became a very prominent port city on the Aegean Sea. Not every city that John wrote to still exists today, but the city of Smyrna does, in fact. And in fact, currently, this city is the 3rd largest city in Turkey today. It is the modern city of Izmir. And if you want to go home and look that up, Izmir is how that is spelled. You can look it up. You can see pictures of it. It's a beautiful place on the Aegean Sea. Beautiful port city on the bay there. About the bay kind of inlets off of the Aegean Sea, something like 30 miles or something like that. It's off of the actual sea itself, a beautiful bay area, and it's called Izmir. And as I said, it is still a port city today, unlike Ephesus. The city Smyrna, that name got its name from its trade in herb. In fact, if you look in Matthew 2:11, you read that the wise men brought 3 gifts to Mary and Joseph at the birth of Christ, or a couple years later, of course. But when they came to visit Christ, they brought 3 gifts. They were what?
Frankincense.
Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. If you look the word myrrh up in your Greek, if you can read Greek, or if you even have Greek, Miles, you can look it up. The word for myrrh there is the word Smyrna. Okay? That is, it means myrrh. And it got its name from myrrh that was used both as an antiseptic and an embalming substance, which is very interesting. I'm sure if you've heard any amount of sermons on the wise men and the gifts that they brought, you know that myrrh was certainly representative and even prophetic of Christ's death. And it was a substance that was used to embalm a dead body. So that is where Smyrna gets its name. The city may have been settled as early as 3000 BC. It goes way back there. However, the first Greek settlement was somewhere around 1000 BC. It was destroyed by the Lydians in 600 BC. Then it was rebuilt again, but it laid in ruins for around 300 years, or just over 300 years, until the Greeks built it. It was rebuilt by Rome around 290 BC, and it became a model Greek city known to always be loyal to Rome. Hence some of the issues that ended up causing the Christians there to suffer that persecution. But it was rebuilt by Rome, and it remains, as I said, to this day now. More than one source that I consulted used the phrase that Smyrna was the most beautiful of all cities. It was known for its beauty. In fact, one of its most famous streets, get this is something I did not know, had not heard before until I studied this, at least I don't think I knew it. One of its most famous streets was called the Street of Gold. That make you think of anything? Of course it does. We all know that there is a street of gold in heaven. That street started at the Bay Area in Smyrna and wound its way through the city and then up the hillside of a mountain called Pagos, or Pegas. I saw it both ways. And along that road, it ended, I believe, at the temple of Zeus at the top of that mountain. Along the way, you found other temples to Apollo, Aphrodite, and many other Greek and Roman gods. So Smyrna, you remember Ephesus was a city of great paganism. Smyrna was also a great pagan city in the sense of its worship of other gods. However, the most prominent religion in the city of Smyrna was its worship of the Roman emperor. You will remember that the emperors came to be thought of as gods. And Smyrna, perhaps for political reasons, I don't know, perhaps just because they worshipped lots of gods, but probably at least some because of political reasons, bought in hook, line, and sinker to the worship of the emperor. And because of that, they became a great Roman city. Because of that, the Roman emperors gave them a lot of freedoms that a lot of cities didn't have. And they prospered because they were protected by the Roman government to a great extent. But because of that, and I mentioned this morning as well, because of that, that was the thing that really centered a great deal on what the reason the Christians were so persecuted. But it was a great religious and political center. It was one of the last cities in Asia Minor to fall to the Turks and the Muslim faith. So that's the city. And I could tell you a lot more about the city itself. One source I read said that somehow Smyrna always seemed to be on the right side of any political conflict. Somehow they had some way of knowing which side to take, and it always ended up being the right side. And so they prospered because of it. And they were protected because of it. So that's the city.
Could you say again, one of the last cities to fall to the...
Is one of the last cities in Asia Minor to fall to the Turks and to the Muslim faith.
Thank you.
All right? Now, the church at Smyrna. We assume that Smyrna, as all the other churches. Now, I remember last week I told you when we talked about Ephesus that Ephesus was pretty much the first of all these 7 churches, and probably all the other 7 churches that are mentioned here in Revelation 2 and 3 were started as a result of the evangelistic effort of the church at Ephesus. Some probably by Paul himself, others by men who Paul trained and sent out. But all of them, and of course we read in Acts 19, verse number 10, about that process of how Paul started the church at Ephesus, and the church at Ephesus reached out and started other churches. And most certainly Smyrna was one of those, and probably, well, I don't know whether it was one of the first ones or not. We don't read of Smyrna anywhere else in the New Testament, at least not as a city. It's only mentioned here in the book of Revelation. We don't know who its pastor is or was. We really don't know a great deal about the church itself. I already mentioned to you that most of the persecution of the church centered around its refusal to worship the Roman emperor. And of course, as Caesars came and went, each new Caesar was just as deified as the other one. And so, and I told you, of course, this morning about Polycarp, who was one of the most famous leaders of this church. He would probably have been in the church. Obviously, we don't know whether he was at the church in Smyrna when the book of Revelation was written to these churches. It was only about 40 or 50 years later that he became a very famous martyr from the church at Smyrna. So was he already in the church at this time? It's kind of assumed that he probably was, but we don't know that for sure. We do know that he was a leader. In fact, we know that he was a bishop at the church in Smyrna at the time of his martyrdom. And that happened in about AD 155. And it was due to his refusal to sacrifice to the Roman emperor. And I told you about that story this morning. What we do know about Smyrna is that the church itself was a faithful church. It was a persecuted church, and the more they loved God, the more they were persecuted, which made them, instead of get bitter, love God more. And the more they loved God, the more they were persecuted. And the more they were persecuted, the more they loved God. Which is often why God allows tribulation and trials. And we talked about that quite a bit this morning. Rather than shying away from persecution, rather than complaining about times that are hard, we need to learn to thank God for them. Because it is those hard times that make us what God wants us to be. Hence the song that Julie and I just sang, God's Refining Fire, that was written referring to Job. When Job says, when I am tried, I will come forth as gold. You all have heard the illustration, and you know the truth. That in the only way for gold to get pure is to be put in the fire and the dross burnt off of it. And that's what God desires to do with each one of us. And far too often, I'm afraid we Christians complain about that process instead of thank God for it. Because it indeed is God's refining fire that makes us what He wants us to be. And we cannot and we will not be what God wants us to be without it. So we need to, as the church did at Smyrna, thank God and willingly be faithful in the midst of persecution and trial. So, that's the place, Smyrna, both the city and the church. Let's talk about the next column, the personal representation of Christ to this city. How does Christ present himself to a city under persecution? It says in verse 8, unto the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these things saith the first and the last, which was dead and is alive. He actually presents himself in two different ways to this church. Both are encouraging, and both point the church to the eternal rather than the immediate. The first, of course, he says, these things saith the first and the last. That, of course, speaks of Christ as the eternal one. Christ and his eternality. If you go back to chapter 1, we already mentioned this in chapter 1, but in chapter 1, verse 17, we see this same thing stated. John says, speaking of this image that he sees, and when I saw him, I fell at his feet as dead. And he laid his right hand upon me, saying unto me, fear not, I am the first and the last. This was a very well-known formula, or saying, if you will, to speak of the fact that God, our God, the only true God, is eternal. Folks, if our God is eternal, and he is, if he knows the beginning from the end, and he does, then nothing we can face is going to surprise him. even more so, many times, what we face, he brings our way to make us who he wants us to be. Because he is the eternal Christ. We find this, you're in Revelation, turn to the last chapter of Revelation, and you'll see that, again, this is said in the very last chapter, Revelation 22, verse 13. As this book is being ended, in verse 13, verse 12 says, "And behold, I come quickly, my reward is with me, to give every man according as his work shall be. I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last." This formula, if you will, goes all the way back to the Old Testament. Turn back to Isaiah chapter 44. Isaiah chapter 44 and verse 6. We see the same statement in Isaiah chapter 44, verse 6. Here he's talking to Jacob, to Israel. God is talking. You see, in verse 1 it says, "Yet now hear, O Jacob, my servant in Israel, whom I have chosen. Thus saith the Lord." So that's who's speaking. And verse 6 says, "Thus saith the Lord, the King of Israel, and his Redeemer, the Lord of hosts, I am the first, and I am the last, and beside me there is no God." Now, again, understand, one of the reasons Christ identifies himself as the first and the last here is to distinguish himself from all other lowercase g gods. Every other god that was worshipped in Smyrna could not say this. And in fact, that's what I pointed out just a minute ago. It's interesting that every Caesar that came along was supposed to be a god. He certainly couldn't say he was first and last, because there was a Caesar before him and there was a Caesar after him. Many, depending on who we're talking about. But God is the first and the last. Can you see how that would be a comfort to someone that's in tribulation? If you're going to serve somebody and be persecuted for it, wouldn't you like to know that that is the true God? Amen. He's worth dying for, people. And that's what Jesus was telling the church here at Smyrna. I am the first and the last. Very clearly he was saying, you can trust me. You've been faithful. Be faithful to me, because what I say, I will do, because I am God. And there's nobody else. But then he also says, not only is he the first and the last, it says, which was dead and is alive. And in that sentence, Jesus identifies himself as the crucified, resurrected, and now living Christ. He gave his life for them. Again, this church is under great persecution. Christ understood, because Christ gave his life on the cross. So these are the two personal representations of Christ that we find in the last part of verse 8. Now this morning I already went through the praise for righteousness, because that was all of my message this morning. Everything I talked about this morning in the message is from those two verses, verses 9 and 10. It talks about their calling to suffer, the cause of their suffering, the accuser in their suffering, the comfort in suffering, are all mentioned there in verses 9 and 10. And I'll not go further on that. we spent this morning talking about it. Now, Smyrna is one of only 2 churches for which the next 3 categories, nothing is said. We have no problem that remains at this church. This church is only commended, it is not reprimanded, because there is no problem that is identified. Now, certainly they weren't perfect, but they were undergoing persecution, and they were faithful in it. And so, God has no rebuke for them, no problem that remains. And since there was no problem that remains, there was no path to restoration that was identified, because there was no reason to restore. The only thing we have there is the phrase that says, be faithful unto death. But that really isn't a path to restoration. It's just a commendation to continue doing what you are doing. And there was no promise if resistant, because again, all 3 of those things go together with churches that are being reprimanded. And we don't have any of that with this suffering church here. And so last of all, we have a promise of reward to this church, which again is I'm sure was a great source of comfort to them and a great encouragement to continue going. We talked about their comfort in suffering from the last part of verse 10, and we talked about the idea there where it says, and ye shall have tribulation 10 days. I believe that was part of the comfort, to encourage the believers there that their persecution was limited. God was in control, and their persecution was limited. But what we have here, the promise of reward, the first thing we see in the last part of verse 10, it says, and I will give thee a crown of life. A crown of life. There are a number of crowns that are talked about in the New Testament. In fact, I believe I've done a series at one point, or not a series, but a message on the different crowns that we read about in the New Testament that are available to the believer. The crown of life is mentioned twice in the New Testament, here, and also in James chapter 1. So turn back just a few pages to James chapter 1. James chapter 1 and verse 12 says, blessed is the man that endureth temptation, for when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life, which the Lord hath promised to them that love him. It's interesting to me, the crown of life is promised to those who love him. What was the problem at Ephesus? They'd lost their first love. Here in Smyrna, they hadn't. They were suffering, they were being persecuted, and they loved God all the more. And so we have this crown of life. Now, there are 2 Greek words for crown. Miles, you're the smart Bible major, right?
Right.
What were they?
I have no idea.
Who's your Greek teacher?
I don't take Greek this semester.
Oh, yeah. There's 2 Greek words, and I don't remember the Greek words, but one of them, I didn't ask you to say the Greek words. I just asked you what they mean.
Okay, that's fair.
Can you tell? Can you
No, I
tell?
still can't tell you.
Okay, still can't tell me that. Okay.
Corona is one.
Okay. When we think of crown, what do we normally think of?
Crown of the head.
Okay, describe it to me.
Beautiful. Glorious.
Crown of the head, top of the head.
Okay, a crown that goes on the top of your head. Usually what do you think of made out of?
Gold.
Gold, okay. has jewels in it, right? Might have little pointed things on it, right? Okay? That's, like the Burger King crown, okay? Okay, bad illustration, okay?
Like a king dress.
Like a king would wear, okay? That is not the crown that is talked about here. Because there is another crown, and it is, let's see, we don't have any Stephens here, do we? I don't think we have any Stephens. It's the Greek word Stephanos, which is the crown that was given at the Olympic Games to the one who is the victor. Okay, a king's crown is for the king and nobody else, right?
Right.
But many people can be victors, right? They can have victory. Why do you think we sang victory in Jesus tonight? Okay, we can all be victors in Christ. And this crown, if you have seen pictures or statues of Romans, you've probably seen a wreath type thing that was put around the head that had leaves. Okay, that's the kind of crown we're talking about. It was a crown that was given to the person that won the race that they were running. I'll get it out. Okay, they won the race that they were running. Try to say that 3 times fast. I can't even say it 1 time. All right, anyway.
But is that the crown we lay at Jesus' feet?
I believe so.
Not the crown of jewels?
I believe so. It's the victor's crown. Whatever crown we get, but every crown in the New Testament is that kind that the believer can get is that kind of crown. I know we always picture giving him some kind of a gold crown, but it's not. And why do we put our crowns at his feet?
To exalt him.
Yes, but there's another better reason.
He's the one that deserves it.
We can't have victory outside of Christ, can we? He's the one that gives us the victory.
Amen.
So anyway, the promise here, the first promise is the crown of life. It is that crown, or that victor's crown, that is made out of a wreath, and it's given to the person that wins the race that they are running. The neat thing here is, in a race, there's only one winner. In a physical race. But in the race of life, everyone can be a winner.
Amen.
We just have to be faithful to Christ. What?
Because we're all running against Satan.
This is true. This is true because we're all running against Satan. Good point, Ms. Chet. And we talked a little bit about that this morning as well. All right, so the promise of reward is the crown of life. And then the second thing it says there in verse 11, it says, "He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. He that overcometh shall not be hurt of the second death." Now again, think about the audience that is reading this. We are talking about Christians in a church that are facing death, physical death, at the hands of the religious and political leaders of their day. And what does Jesus say? He says, "He that overcomes shall not be hurt of the second death." And by the way, that word "not," it really ought to be in all capitals, bolded, underlined, in a font as big as the page. Okay? The Greek word there is the strongest word for negative, not. This absolutely will not happen, is what John is saying. And he says, "He that overcometh shall not be hurt of the second death." And of course, we read in Revelation the second death is being cast into the lake of fire. and it's reserved for the devil and his angels and all those that reject Christ. But we, as believers, will not be hurt of the second death because we are trusting in Christ. What that means, folks, is that we are overcomers.
Hallelujah. Blood of the Lamb.
We are overcomers by the blood of the Lamb, that's right. And that is what John writes to this church. The church that's suffering is reminded, keep going, because one day you're going to get the victor's crown, and you're also not going to see the second death. There really was nothing else that the Holy Spirit could tell these believers that would have been more encouraging, and that should be more encouraging to us today as we consider our own willingness to suffer for Christ. Life is not about this life, this earth. Life for every human being is about what happens after this physical life. And we need to keep that in mind at all times and ever before our face. The trials and tests and trouble of this life, the Bible says, are nothing to be compared with heaven. There's not one test or one trouble that you can face. And students, I'm not talking about the piece of paper that you put answers on. The songwriter said, "It will be worth it all when we see Jesus." Life trials will seem so small when we see Christ.
One glimpse of your face, all sorrow will erase.
So bravely
run the race
till we
till
see.
we see Christ.
Yes. It will be worth it all, folks. And that is the message to this suffering church. It will be worth it all. Hallelujah. So I encourage you tonight, be an overcomer. Because there is a crown of life waiting for you. There is a victor's crown. And you do not have to fear the second death. Let's live for Christ and be faithful to Him.